we are in an abusive relationship with nature. And we all know what abusive relationships look like. They are when one part always takes, never gives anything back. That's the relationship we have with nature right now. And that will not end well for us. So it has to change.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm here with Tim Christophersen, a man I first came across recently when I picked up his book, Generation Restoration, How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. Of course, I saw that book and thought, I've got to read it. And then I realized that Tim Christophersen, sitting opposite me now, was the United Nations Environment Programme leader who spearheaded the great UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and really coined the phrase generation restoration, which is one that I've used the whole time without really knowing why, Tim. I just have this strong sense that it's our generation that's going to leave the world and Mother Nature in a better place than we found it. Tim is no longer at the United Nations Environment Programme. He's got a very exciting role as Vice President of Climate Action at Salesforce, which is one of the world's biggest software companies. And it is big technology companies that are spearheading corporate efforts on nature through the purchase of nature-based carbon credits and so on. If you look at many of the rewilding projects that are happening in Britain and abroad right now, they are funded through the purchase of nature-based carbon credits by the likes of Salesforce. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast, Tim. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me.
I love Rewilding the World, so it's a pleasure to be here, Ben. Thanks.
Tim, can we jump straight into this generation restoration idea? You know, how did you find yourself at the United Nations Environment Programme building the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration? And what does it mean from a kind of in a global sense? What does it mean?
So the United Nations main product is consensus, right? When I worked at UNEP, this was in 2019, the UN General Assembly was deliberating this idea of a UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And these moments where everybody agrees on something, they are rare in global politics, now probably more than ever. But at the time, we had to make sure all the member states would agree to have this decade. It was then unanimously adopted, even though some countries stated some objections, like, it had to be what they call revenue neutral, so the UN wouldn't have to spend additional budget. But the idea from the beginning was to set this UN decade up in what we called a New Power way. New Power is a book by Jeremy Hymans and Jeffrey Timms, and it's about how power works in our digital, hyper-connected world. So we wanted to set the UN decade up in a way that everybody who has a project or has interest can participate and feel part of an effort that is larger than themselves. And in this case, as large as the world. So that's where the importance of the hashtag Generation Restoration came in, because then you can, wherever you post on Instagram, LinkedIn, you can use that hashtag and signal that you're part of a larger global effort, which all of humanity is engaged in. The hashtag was actually coined by a brilliant young woman called Selena Abrams, who's now with the Center for World Agroforestry in Nairobi. But it's really worked well. If you go on Instagram right now, for example, I think there's about 140,000 posts with that hashtag showing that we're not alone. There's tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands of projects and people who are restoring ecosystems worldwide.
So we're roughly halfway through the decade on ecosystem restoration. It's 2021 to 2030. And it's backed as an initiative or a movement by all UN member states and now enormous numbers of partners across the private sector, third sector, and so on to halt and reverse ecosystem degradation worldwide. Do you think we can yet really think of ourselves as the generation that is restoring nature on the scale that it needs to happen? Do you think there is sufficient momentum that we can be that optimistic? It feels like it to me, by the way. I'm sitting here in South Somerset right now, and the birdsong at this time of day is just exquisite. We have tremendous recovery of nature happening in all directions here in this part of South Somerset, and similar things are happening in landscapes across England in a way that I couldn't have even imagined would happen maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Is that perspective or that optimism something that you share from a kind of global perspective?
Nature is certainly our most powerful ally in this movement, that's for sure. And the thing about optimism, as I write in the book, I use Paul Romer's definition of what optimism is. What we need is not the unconditional optimism of a child waiting for presents. That's not going to happen. But we need the conditional optimism of a child wanting to build a treehouse and then runs around and gets all their relatives and friends mobilized and says, well, couldn't we build something really cool? And then everybody pitches in and suddenly you're building something amazing. I think that's the point where we're at now. And that's the optimism we need because it's a mindset. It's not so much that something that happens to you from the outside. Optimism is a mindset. What I see in the first 5 years of the UN decade is almost exponential growth of the movements and sub-movements like regenerative agriculture and things that are happening in many parts of the world. Private finance, for example, into nature has gone up 11-fold in the last 4 years to over 100 billion now. It's still small, but if we continue this trajectory for the next 5 years, we will definitely make a huge, huge impact. And then, of course, beyond the next 5 years, this decade ends in 2030, but the efforts don't end in 2030.
I've been a little bit involved in the formation of the new Global Rewilding Alliance. In one sense, it's kind of like a private sector answer to the UN decade on ecosystem restoration, because it's built this enormous coalition very quickly of groups from around the world, some of which are public sector groups like in England's own Forestry England. Some of them are charities or local community initiatives. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but they're all about restoration of nature. Is that kind of the idea that I don't really know how the UN particularly operates, but is the idea to build a kind of umbrella beneath which a whole bunch of different loose coalition of organizations is delivering restoration at scale, and by doing that, just to create impetus globally?
That's right. So right now there are over 300 different partner organizations, including the World Bank and very large organizations, all the way to restoration implementers on the ground. There is an action plan that has, for example, the World Economic Forum leading with about 100 large companies on mobilizing $10 billion for what is now called the Forest Future Alliance. So there are parts that play into the UN decade. I think what's more important even than this sort of formal collaboration as part of the UN decade is that we spread the mindset of seeing nature in a different way. Resetting our relationship with nature is at the heart of the UN decade. And when we wrote the strategy, we deliberately made ecological literacy and environmental education a very important part of the decade's approach, because that then informs and facilitates everything else, including the importance of government investments, public-private partnerships. Well, let me give you one example of something that the UN decade has triggered, and we call that the World Restoration Flagships. I still sit on the advisory board for the UN decade, so I'm still involved in some of these. You had one of them on your show recently, Acción Andina, this amazing movement of restoring all of the Andes. There are now almost 30 of those very, very large scale, sometimes 1 million hectare plus ecosystem restoration projects, rewilding projects around the world that have the UN World Restoration Flagship status. And that gives them a lot of backing with their national governments. Often they span more than one country, like the Great Green Wall in Africa, or the Mesoamerican Dry Corridor in Central America. And that label by the UN also allows them then to see the role of the private sector in a different way. I want to dive down a little bit into this in the Mata Atlantica, which I think you also know well and have talked about on the podcast, because it's a good example of the sheer scale that we need for rewilding the planet. This is not about small projects that are happening everywhere. It's about planetary scale, infrastructure level restoration efforts that are at a vast scale. So the Mata Atlantica is the eastern seaboard of Brazil. And they have a goal to restore 15 million hectares. And over the last 30 years, there's now over 350 NGOs involved. They managed to restore 1 million hectares, which is impressive. But 30 years, 1 million hectares, it would take 450 years to restore everything they've set out to do. So there has to be a step change in the pace and scale of how they can restore. We went there with a small team from the UN decade and then mapped out who should actually pay for this massive restoration, because based on who would benefit from the restored ecosystem services. And the ballpark figure for the restoration investment opportunity is about $60 billion for that. Just to give a ballpark. So mapping out which large companies, which governments, which city, like the city of Sao Paulo's drinking water comes from there, should pay for those massive restorations. And then how we can set that up is part of what the UN Decade can unlock. And we already see now large investments that have followed that initial report and that initial assessment.
Yeah, I think what's really exciting is organizations like Salesforce, where you now work, are really stepping up and participating in their own self-interest in the restoration of nature through such things as nature positive pledges, through large-scale acquisitions of carbon removals through nature restoration, through the purchase of voluntary biodiversity credits. Insetting is an idea that I'm sure we'll discuss in a little bit. And so when I've attended some of these larger events, I went to the Earthshock Prize, for example, in Rio, and met a bunch of people. I spent some time hiking with Florent Kaiser from Acción Andina. We went up to see the Cristo the Redeemer. We went with another Earthshock winner, the brilliant Mark Day, who's building a massive rewilding project in Kazakhstan, the Altan Dala. He's been a guest on the podcast before. But the kinds of people we ran into at the conference were people from big corporations, many of them, and with real intentions to do things on the kind of scale that perhaps charities aren't able to achieve on their own. But at the heart of this whole thing, this generation restoration idea, at the heart of everything that we've been talking about, is this idea of how we fix our relationship crisis with Mother Nature. I was incredibly close with my late uncle, Teddy Goldsmith. He was my father's older brother, and my father died when I was quite young. And Teddy was kind of a father figure, both before my father's death and even more afterwards for my older brother, Zach, and me. And he was the founding editor of The Ecologist magazine and had been involved in a number of environmental initiatives stretching way back to the late 1950s. He was the first Green Party candidate in the United Kingdom. So when Teddy died in 2007 and we published that little brochure that you produced for a funeral, we printed one of his quotes on the inside front cover. And it said, "The ecology we need is not the ecology that involves viewing the ecosphere on which we depend for our survival at a distance and with scientific detachment. We will not save our planet by means of a conscious, rational, and unemotional decision, a sort of ecological contract based on a cost-benefit analysis. A moral and emotional commitment is required. Indeed, one of the key tasks of ecology must be to redirect our emotions so that they may fulfill the role they were designed for, to commit us to what should be the overriding human enterprise of maintaining the critical order of the ecosphere." So my Uncle Teddy said this a long, long time ago, decades ago, and we reproduced it at his funeral. And it's kind of what you're saying is at the heart of the whole thing is a reset that is needed of our relationship with Mother Nature. And this is what you talk about in your book, and it's really how you spend your life as well, your personal life there in Denmark. So how do we achieve that? What is that? For me, that's the big question. The economic realignment that we need will follow from that. But how do we reset our relationship with Mother Nature?
So I think there's a lot of growing awareness that there's something amiss in our current relationship with nature. We are in an abusive relationship with nature, and we all know what abusive relationships look like. They are when one part always takes, never gives anything back. That's the relationship we have with nature right now. And that will not end well for us. So it has to change. I think there's a growing realization that we have to change it. And like any good relationship, it can start in many different ways. One of them is food. It's in the book I talk about the basic ecological literacy and how to regain it. The best way to start is most of us eat 3 times a day, and of course, the food we eat, the water we drink, it all comes from nature. And tracing that source back to where does your food actually come from? Who is your farmer? How do they farm? Where do they live? Where does your water come from? Where does your municipality's water come from? Finding out where and how you depend on nature is a good step to restart that relationship. And the next step is, of course, listening, like in any good relationship. You listen to nature, and that's probably the biggest ask I have for the readers of the book, is to just spend more time with nature like you did this morning with the birds. And we can all experience nature, even if you live in a city, there's often an amazing amount of wildlife to be observed. So rebuilding that relationship will take some time, but I think we are, as a species, as a global civilization, we are ready for that next step, or let's say that relearning of ecological literacy. Because of course, indigenous peoples have known this for millennia. It's just been taught out of us about the era of enlightenment onwards that we are not part of nature. Nature is something else. Nature's out there. We are here. We can only see nature in a rational and later economic sense. And all of that is very short-sighted, and it will change because it has to change.
You use a lot the term biophilia. And of course, that's a term that was coined by the great writer E.O. Wilson. And he argued that this biophilia, this innate love that human beings have for the non-human world, it never fully goes away. It can't be taught out of us. It simply goes somewhat dormant. And he points out, did point out that people will pay twice the price for an apartment which overlooks the park, for example, or they'll choose a hospital room in which to recuperate through the window of which you can see nature. So how do we reawaken this innate biophilia? I mean, often it's trauma, I think. People suffer in their own lives and they find themselves sitting on a park bench watching the birds or listening to the bird song or watching the river flow by, or perhaps they spend some time in the countryside. The COVID pandemic was traumatic for a lot of people. If not the COVID, then the lockdowns. And as a result, people were forced to reconnect locally with nature. And I do think they played a significant role in this great yearning that we're witnessing today in Britain and elsewhere for more nature in our lives, for wildness to be woven through the fabric of our towns and cities. And a lot of exciting things happened on the back of those COVID lockdowns as a result of people's instinctive reconnection with nature through that traumatic time. But what about the role of religion? Because if you talk to people who are knowledgeable about or part of indigenous communities around the world who still practice animistic or shamanistic spirituality, which is all about direct, practical and spiritual connection with nature as a kind of manifestation of something beyond, a kind of mirror on which something else is reflected. I've heard it described as. What's happened in our monotheistic religious communities, the great Muslim and Christian communities around the world, that nature has fallen off its pedestal. King Charles talks about the Enlightenment. He says that what you mentioned it earlier, he said that in the Enlightenment, we separated nature from the spiritual, and we put everything spiritual into an invisible place up in the sky, and we worship that from afar. But then we get back to our day jobs and follow a mechanistic or Cartesian worldview of taking what we need from nature, take. What's the root of it, and how do we, working within the context of these major religions that have billions of followers, two of them, how do we get nature back in the mix?
The greatest supportive tweet we received when we launched the UN Decade was actually from Pope Francis, who, as you know, in Laudato Si, in his encyclical, who set out to heal that rift. When you read it, it's actually an amazing book about our relationship with nature and how we are nature. We're not just the stewards of nature. We are part of nature. And as such, taking over that responsibility again for all of creation, because in most world religions, that is actually a universal theme. We are here for a purpose, and part of that includes taking stewardship for all of creation and for each other. That is a universal theme in world religions. Rediscovering that will be hard because at the moment our economic system is also programmed against that kind of rediscovery and relationship with nature. Nature by necessity in our economy is treated as a commodity. And that, of course, negates any kind of relationship like you would have with your family or your community or your surrounding, a relationship of reciprocity. If nature is just a commodity, it cannot be our home. And that economic system also has to change. And it's starting to happen slowly. And coming back to the United Nations, they get a lot of flack for being slow sometimes. But when they do make change, it might be at a glacial pace, but it's also at the glacial power. And in 2012, when the UN introduced a new way of measuring natural capital in the system of environmental economic accounting. It's basically the statistics handbook for the world, how governments measure national wealth. That small change now makes things like the biodiversity net gain and other great programs possible. So introducing a new way of seeing our economy and measuring it beyond GDP is really essential and is part of that shift. At the moment, both our economic system and the way we, in the book, I call it our philosophical autopilot of the Western world. They lock us into this destructive relationship with nature.
So let's say that the world is undergoing a cultural or even a spiritual shift in which people are yearning for greater connection with nature. And I believe that to be the case, not just here in Britain, where it's absolutely the case, but I think everywhere. What's needed in parallel is an economic shift whereby we move from valuing nature at zero, which has been the case until now, only valuable when you turn it into something that can then be used. And forest is only valuable when you cut the trees down and turn them into wood, which can be used for building furniture or firewood, for example. An ocean ecosystem is valueless, only the fish which you catch from it and then package up and sell. So how do we bring about an acceleration of that economic shift? Because it seems that the world's largest companies are trying to do just that. And you're part of that movement. You've moved from the UN to Salesforce, one of the world's biggest software companies. Can you describe to me a little bit about what Salesforce is doing and why? Why would Salesforce bother? They produce software. They have shareholders who want to see investment returns. And I'd understand easier perhaps if Salesforce is producing apricots and you need pollinating insects and fresh water and good soil in order to produce those apricots. You may invest in protecting those assets, that natural capital, in order to sustain your own bottom line. But Salesforce, why? And perhaps we could touch upon mangroves, because I know that Salesforce has been a major player in the drive to restore thousands of hectares of mangroves around the world.
So we have a nature positive strategy at Salesforce, which, as you know, is one of the 100 largest companies in the world. And we have that strategy for two reasons. One is over half of our customers, hundreds of thousands of companies that use our software, are highly dependent on nature in their supply chains. So we see this as a resilience investment also in the future customer base. And obviously for all our staff, which is the other main reason, nature and ecosystem services are essential for our productivity, our health, our well-being. We're headquartered in California, where, as you know, there's more and more wildfires. This is a real impact to our employees if nature is further degraded. So we set out about 5 years ago, launched something called the Trillion Trees Initiative at that time. It's now called the Forest Future Alliance at the World Economic Forum, to also get a lot of other companies into this space. We then helped to pilot the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures when they developed their LEAP framework, which helps companies like ours assess what impact they have on nature. Our biggest impact clearly is water for our offices, also for the compute that we use. We don't have our own data centers, but data centers provide us with what we need. And we invest our restoration efforts. We have a goal to plant 100 million trees by 2030. We do that in watersheds that are in water-stressed areas where we need to replenish the water table. And we buy a large number of carbon credits, including, as you mentioned, we have a 1 million ton purchase commitment for blue carbon. So these would be mangrove projects largely.
So it's the employees want the company to be participating in what seems to be the most important movement in the world. The lenders, the shareholders, the customers. So that's all the softer stuff. And then what about in hard terms? In terms of measuring stuff that you've bought that can be applied to your accounting. So buying, for example, carbon that has been removed from the atmosphere by the ton, by way of restoring nature-based carbon. The market is overwhelmingly driven by voluntary buyers. And Microsoft is the largest of those buyers, but by no means the only one. And that is becoming the largest source of funding for rewilding projects all over the world, including here in Britain. So how do we get our heads around this motivation that they have to buy that carbon in that way at that scale?
Like many large companies, we have a science-based target for our decarbonization. So our short-term target, for example, is a 67% reduction by 2030. And we cannot achieve our longer-term target of 97% by 2040 without compensating some of what is called the ongoing emissions. So while we purchase only renewable electricity, for example, across our own operations, we do have travel, we fly to places. So there are emissions that we cannot right now reduce. And we compensate for that through the purchase of high quality carbon credits. Now, the carbon market, unfortunately, has received a lot of flack, but it is, as you say, really, really important for nature because it's part of that initial catalytic funding we need now. I think in the longer term, other funding will have to come in. It can't be the carbon market alone.
But in the era of Trump and in the era of increasingly global skepticism around the very scientific basis of climate change, even though farmers especially see it with their own eyes, what's to stop large companies just saying, yeah, we don't need to do this anymore? Politically, it may even harm us. It may even harm us politically if we engage in anything that looks like climate action. You've seen Bill Gates' comments, for example, on climate that seem perfectly designed to appease the Trump administration during this political era that we're in.
Well, unfortunately, a lot of big companies are doing exactly that, which is nothing. The risk of inaction for companies at the moment is lower than the risk of taking climate action. And we have to flip that around. It has to be easy, seamless, and very transparent and clear how and why they should invest. In my perspective, the voluntary carbon market is mostly about pre-compliance. Ultimately, we need carbon markets that are compliance markets, which are already the largest carbon markets in the world. If we would manage, for example, to get nature into the European emissions trading scheme, into the ETS, which is a multiple hundreds of billions of dollars annual market, if just 5% of that would go to nature, it would be several billions per year. And that kind of inclusion and move into compliance market is really important because too few companies participate in the voluntary carbon market. We see that we're often just always the same people from the same companies speaking on these panels and at events. So we need a lot more participation. And I think the only way to get there is through compliance markets.
And are any of the big emissions trading schemes in the world, because of course they exist all over the world, in Australia, New Zealand, China, European Union has the biggest, I think, California and a bunch of Western states. Is there a real prospect in the near term that any of those emissions trading schemes will start to permit nature-based carbon removals in their calculations?
Well, some already do. And at the European level, that discussion is happening right now. Actually, until July, the European Commission will have to table a new proposal. There is a European framework for nature-based solutions, including from farming, which in my perspective would be very important to include. There is a bit of infighting in the climate movement, unfortunately, between the technology and the nature people in carbon removals. And I think you've followed some of that. There is the carbon dioxide removal faction with direct air capture and technologies like that. And of course, for somebody who studied forestry like myself, it's pretty obvious that trees do that much better and for free, sort of. But we have a very technology-focused group of climate action. And I'm not saying that we don't need that. It's about a portfolio approach. At Salesforce, we also have a $100 million commitment to buy CDR technology credits. And we founded the Symbiosis Coalition with Meta, Microsoft, and Google for a 20 million ton high-quality nature-based removal offtake market signal. We need all of the above, but leaving nature by the wayside as a solution in these very large compliance markets would be a mistake. And we have, at the moment, the opportunity to fix that.
Yeah, I'm having lunch with Tim Kruger from Oxford University next week. He's focused on those more mechanical approaches to capturing carbon directly from the atmosphere. For example, applying a giant antacid to the ocean, through calcium carbonate and these kinds of ideas. He believes that we'll need both. The scale of the problem is such that we need to restore nature at scale, we need to restore agricultural soils at scale, and we need more. And I'm going to have that discussion with him, and maybe I'll invite him on the podcast to talk about it. In the meantime, I'm also interested in this idea of insetting, which is where companies directly link their carbon removals activity through nature restoration to their own supply chain. We talked about apricots, but another example might be Evian water. I've made this example up, but clearly the water that they're bottling comes from a landscape at Evian. So rewilding and restoring that landscape and preventing it from being chemicalized by agriculture, for example, or polluted in other ways, is a very obvious and practical business move for Evian. But if they do that in parallel with measuring the carbon that is sequestered through that restoration process, then they are getting effectively inset carbon. I find that it's less relevant perhaps for a business like Salesforce and more relevant for a business which is closer to the earth and to the land, but still potentially a big part of the story.
Very big part of the story. Agriculture is to our nature movement what energy is to climate at large, right? So we have to fix the agri-food system, and especially in that system and all the agri-food and many of the retail companies, insetting will play an important role and already is. The positive side of insetting also is that you can more easily go beyond carbon. For a large agricultural cooperative, for example, they can have requirements in their supply chain that are both good for water, for biodiversity, for carbon, so that you have a more holistic approach, not what we sometimes call carbon tunnel vision in the voluntary carbon market, where you only focus on carbon maximization at the expense sometimes of social or environmental benefits.
So we've talked about the UN Decade on Restoration and this idea of generation restoration, which you lay out so beautifully in your book. And that's kind of the big picture. And we've talked about the how are we going to fund this? And ultimately, the private sector, the world's largest companies are really going to be the driving force if this is going to get done at the scale we need. Companies like Salesforce and many, many others. And we've talked about the fundamental challenge, which is an emotional or even a spiritual reset of our relationship with Mother Nature. And we could have talked about that a whole lot more. But I'd like to talk about your personal experience, because for me, this is entirely personal. It's my own personal love of nature from the earliest years of my memory, growing up in West London, where I spent all of my spare time outside, fascinated by wild animals and putting up bird boxes and digging out ponds and just spending time in nature. This was my love and has been an incredibly important, maybe the most important thing for me in both my inner and my outer life. So I'd like to talk about your story, because presumably it's the same. I understand you grew up in Germany. Your grandfather was a huge influence on you. Can you just tell me a little bit about your own personal connection with nature and how it brought you to having the career you have?
I think I did my first ichthys restoration projects when I was 10, restoring the pond in my grandparents' yard. And I didn't know all these terms at that time, but I just saw that ecosystem was suffering and that I could play a role in ensuring it would spring back to abundance and diversity. It was just a natural impulse I had. And so that has stayed with me. We bought a farm here in Denmark. My family and I bought 5 years ago. It used to be dairy farm. Now we're switching it to permaculture and rotational grazing. When I say we, my wife does most of the farm management and planning while I have a day job with Salesforce. But it's a really fascinating family adventure. What is astounding to me is how quickly nature bounces back. You spoke about this earlier. It's almost like nature is waiting for our intentionality and our approach. And once you come with that intention to restore, nature responds. It's an active response. It's not just something that is mechanical, or there's a relationship building, and nature responds. Nature works with us if we step into that role of benign ecosystem engineers. Humans are ecosystem engineers, just like beavers are, or elephants, or earthworms. We just happen to be the most powerful ecosystem engineer. And so far, we've used our power mostly to destroy nature. We can use it to rebuild nature in collaboration with nature.
Yes, I've witnessed the same. The power of nature to recover is simply staggering. The abundance at levels that we just can't believe. And of course, people then start to say, "Oh my God, there's too many." The extinct red kite was reintroduced in Britain very successfully in the 90s, and now there's several thousand pairs, and people say there's too many of them. We're overrun with red kite because we're so unused to seeing the abundance that nature can produce. And of course, it's the definition of limitless love and generosity the natural world. We have a tiny vegetable garden. I mean, it's not tiny. It supplies my wife's restaurant, so it's an acre. But in the context of a 300-acre farm, 1 acre vegetable garden is not very big. And the amount of stuff it produces for us, just potatoes to last us all through the winter, the fruit trees around the outside, we have an orchard of another acre or so, just buckets and buckets and buckets, and we spend the whole of autumn pickling and preserving and all that kind of stuff. It's the very definition of unconditional love.
It is.
And I think this has to be the fuel for us individually and collectively for restoring nature. It has to be this two-way relationship, a relationship of two-way love and two-way giving.
Nature's natural state is diversity and abundance. So when we allow that to happen and we become part of that flow again, this will bounce back. And I think that's why I said nature is our most powerful ally in this movement. In generation restoration, I also speak about the various roles that we as humans can take. And they, of course, include our relationship with nature, where we live, in what we eat. It also includes our day jobs and how we can, in wherever we work, have more of an influence on nature, whether we're a lawyer or an economist or a teacher or a doctor. Everybody can do something to rebuild that relationship with nature into the fabric of society. Because I think where the magic really happens is when we get the private sector, the public sector, civil society to work together towards these very large ecosystem restoration goals.
Tim, I just want to talk to you finally about the very exciting rewilding movement that's growing up in Denmark. Because Denmark's not dissimilar from England in that nearly all of the space has been converted to farmland, even those parts which are not particularly good for farming. And yet in recent months, or certainly not very many years, not only have a bunch of private sector initiatives grown up, the Hempel Foundation, for example, a Danish foundation has been acquiring land for rewilding at scale in Jutland. You have certain private individuals doing the same. And now you have this government policy of taking the least productive farmland and giving it back to nature across the whole country. So what does that all mean? I mean, it's out of nowhere, Denmark is becoming a major player in generation restoration.
It is exciting. And at the same time, there's a battle happening, I would say, right now between conventional agriculture and these new approaches. There are several times more pigs and cows in Denmark than there are people. So there's a very, very intense agriculture here. What we see happening is that permaculture, agroforestry, which for the first time can be funded under the European agricultural policy in Denmark, they are growing, but we still need to make the larger shifts to make that happen on a much larger scale. Denmark is also reforesting massive amounts of land with both government and private funding. So there are a lot of positive things happening. The next big, I think, frontier is to change the massive animal factory farming we have in the country here and ensure that is done in a different way, like livestock is now produced in large rewilding estates in the UK, for example. That's not yet happening here in Denmark, but hopefully it will soon.
Well, I'm very excited to visit the handful of pretty sizable and growing rewilding projects that I read about here and there in my email inbox. The Hempel Foundation have kindly invited me, and I have another friend who is rewilding in the north of Jutland. In the meantime, Tim, I'm so grateful to you for everything you do. You are really a pillar of action and strength and inspiration in our movement. And I feel very lucky to have met you here at Canwood and to have come across your book and your work. Thank you for taking the time to join me on the podcast today.
Thank you very much, Ben.
I really hope that Tim's prophecies come true and that we are generation restoration, the first generation to fix our relationship with Mother Nature and leave the natural world in a better shape than we found it. For my next episode, I've invited Alison Fox, Chief Executive of American Prairie, to come back onto the podcast 3 years since she was my first ever guest. American Prairie is a hugely ambitious restoration project that is stitching together what will eventually be millions of acres of restored prairie grasslands in northern Montana with bison. But with growing success, of course, the organization has come under attack from the state administration in Montana and now the federal government under Donald Trump. And so I've invited Alison on to come and talk about their latest news and the turbulence that they're currently going through.